Okay, so feel free to move around a little bit, get comfortable, and offer some Dharma reflections. I'm really grateful to be here this morning. Um, there's something special about just practicing together as a community, even on Zoom, and especially on Zoom sometimes, especially right now as I'm not feeling very well. I can still show up here and practice. And I find it so supportive and profound. So thank you all so much for being here. It's also this reminder that we're not doing this practice alone. Just seeing all these boxes with faces in them uh, has a special meaning. And yeah, I kind of want to reflect on what that means, especially right now in this particular moment in the world. In the Pali teachings, which are the teachings of the Buddha, there's this term, and I'll do it slowly because I need to be able to pronounce it, but it's Sila Bhatta Paramasa. Sila Bhatta Paramasa. And it's usually translated as clinging to rites and rituals. And it's one of the first fetters. The fetters are these, there's 10 fetters. They're these knots, I like to call them knots in the heart that keep us tied to the cycle of suffering, of samsara. And the more, as we move towards liberation, these knots tend to loosen and be let go of. And so the stages of awakening traditionally are they happen as you loosen these fetters. And so this clinging to rites and rituals is one of the first fetters, one of the first knots that loosens as we kind of become more and more awake, alongside the tendency to take ourselves too personally and the habit of chronic doubt. These things, again, gradually loosen over time. And this one sits at the threshold of what the tradition calls irreversible awakening. So you can reach a point where there's no more going back. And we often hear it applied to the mistake of taking the form of practice for the thing itself, for the awakening itself. The map for the territory, or the technique for the liberation. And that's very real. That happens pretty regularly. It's something I get drawn into often. But I think there's a subtler expression that's worth talking about this morning. The fact that this fetter happens so early on the path, not somewhere that's really deep in the journey, but right at the threshold. For me, it's saying something, about its importance. Seeing through it clearly is not a minor refinement. It's kind of what begins to loosen all of the other fetters as well. And so we could say it's like what awakening looks like, when this fetter is released. And the subtle expression that I'm thinking of is, what if sometimes we use the form of practice, the cushion, the Sangha, our mindfulness practice, not as a path toward liberation, but as a shelter from something that we'd rather not feel. And I've noticed myself get into this trap at times. I don't want to create unease And there's no kind of accusation in this. Most of us have probably been practicing long enough to recognize this movement in ourselves, where practice becomes an avoidance tactic. Um, for myself, I've watched it in informal sitting. The way I'll sometimes reach for a technique when something very raw is present, which can be skillful because we can get caught in these loops sometimes, and sometimes we need a particular technique to kind of soften the continuous cycle. But sometimes it can be a crutch as well. That's something that we use to avoid. The Buddha spoke often of, and you've probably heard Kitasaro talk about this because he talks about it a lot, of yoniso manasikara, which translates as wise attention, or attention to the roots, or attention to the origins of where things come from. And the yoni points towards the source. It means womb, the place where things are born, or a root. And so to follow experience, yoniso, is to trace it back to what's actually generating it, rather than kind of staying on the surface of what's happening. So what's the quality of this moment right now? And if you've been tracking the world recently, and I'm sure you have to some extent, in whatever kind of doses you can sustain, there's something that's been accumulating, we could say. A weight, a vigilance, kind of this low-grade, constant scanning of conditions that the nervous system does quite automatically when it senses that things are unstable or unsafe. And this is not neurosis. This is a sensitive system doing exactly what it has evolved to do, which is to look out for possible danger. And one of the genuine gifts of our practice is that it offers the nervous system a real pause from that scanning. At least it can. And this is something that's restorative, and it's something that we need. And yet, Yoniso Manasikara asks us to look just a little bit more carefully. When we step away from the news, or we step away from our social media feeds, the accumulated dread of the week, we sit down and there's a slight sense of a door perhaps closing, a relief that can carry underneath it. This kind of thought of, I don't have to feel that right now. And this is worth knowing, not to amplify it, not to punish ourselves for needing rest, but to simplify, to see the movement more clearly. Because that motion, that slight turning of awareness away from what's difficult, is itself something that can be known. And there's a particular feeling to it, tone to it. And what's clearly known, as we get to the root of these things, what's clearly known begins on its own to loosen its hold. Yeah. And so much of what the Buddha was teaching us is just to know, to get to know, to see, to be aware of. And then the process is natural of loosening these knots. It happens on its own. The Tibetan word for meditation is this word gom, and it just means to become familiar with. So we're becoming more and more and more familiar with our mind and our tendencies and our patterns. And I began to think of the Buddha, what he said to Ananda, who had offered that good friendship was half the spiritual life. And the Buddha said, no, Ananda, it is the whole of the spiritual life. And I find this really striking because it places us in kind of this irreducible relationship. Our practice is not a private project that eventually produces a person who no longer needs the world. We're always in relationship in some way with ourselves, with the things around us, with situations. And the awakening that we're cultivating is a transformation of how we're meeting what's actually here right now in this moment, including what's hard, including what's asking something of us, including this particular and difficult moment in history. And so these fetters, they're protective habits. They're deeply intelligent ones that once made sense. They make sense to our system of protection. But they keep us smaller. They keep us smaller than we actually are. And as I said before, the practice isn't to overcome them through force or shame or bypassing. It's to see them clearly. And then, as I said, as we see them more clearly, they begin to release on their own. So the Buddha is asking us to turn toward, which you can't always do. It can be difficult. Sometimes we need to take a break. And so when I say, this is a gentle self-inquiry, gentle doesn't mean soft. It's because the stakes are really high. The stakes are liberation. This means going gradually. There's this line from Shantideva, who was a Mahayana teacher, monk at Nalanda. And it says essentially, just to paraphrase, if suffering can be remedied, why be troubled? And if it can't, what is the use of being troubled? And the Dalai Lama talks about this a lot. And it gets read sometimes as kind of Buddhist stoicism, like this, non-feeling thing, this permission to disengage. But I think he means something much more radical. He means to stay present enough to know which kind of suffering this is. To stay present enough to discern what's actually being asked of us. And that discernment actually requires feeling the thing. Not managing it from a careful distance, but feeling the thing. And so this equanimity that Shantideva speaks of is not, equanimity of someone who has successfully avoided being touched by anything. That's not going to happen. It's the equanimity of someone who has been touched and not collapsed. And this is where our practice is leading us. So the inquiry I want to leave you with is held lightly. There's no agenda here. Not am I bypassing? That question tends to become its own kind of thing. But rather, is there something I've been carrying that I haven't quite let land? Is there something I'm keeping at arm's length that I could perhaps look at more directly? Not to force, not to manufacture, grief or some type of urgency, but to acknowledge that, yes, there is something moving in this collective body right now. Yes, I've been managing my proximity to it carefully, as we all have, because the intensity is real, and our capacity is finite. Yeah. And the practice is really, even just for a few minutes, might simply be to let it be known, even just for a moment. Not swept into content or analysis, but just felt in the body as the actual texture of this moment, a person sitting alive in this particular world this week. Yeah. And so Yoniso Manasikara doesn't end when we stand up from our practice. But even, more than that, the willingness to feel what's actually here without turning away, without the subtle management of distance. And this is not only ethical practice, this is what the tradition means by a heart that's been freed. It's been freed from entanglement. Yeah. And nibbana is sometimes described as the cessation of craving, which is what it is, according to the Four Noble Truths. And craving includes the craving to not feel. This kind of subtle reaching away from difficulty toward some cleaner version of this life. Yeah. And most of us, I know I do, know that reaching very intimately. Yeah. I remember there was a point in my life where I thought to myself, wow, I feel like I'm always bracing for impact. This constant bracing against things. Yeah. And the fear is once that bracing is released, that there's again, in my experience, there could be a void or I'll lose something. But what remains after we kind of stop bracing, it's presence is there. Presence beyond. And this is really what we're training toward, more presence, more fullness. Not a self that is finally protected from the world, which can be the subtle longing. Something much, much closer to what we actually are, which has never needed protection in the first place. Yeah. So, yeah, that's enough. That's this practice. Thank you for being here. I'm actually going to stop it there for today and not have a discussion just because I feel really bad. Very sick. So I hope that's okay. If you do have any questions or any comments or anything, please, you can always email me at adam@sacredmountainsangha.org. Hopefully this was helpful, and I really appreciate you all being here today. Let's just pause for a moment. Yeah. just in gratitude for these the teachers in our lives and the teachings and their infinite forms. The beauty of being able to be present and aware and awake, and this context that the Buddha's teachings give us to live in this world, and to live in this world and free the heart at the same time. May all beings be safe and well. May all beings experience the perfect peace. May all beings feel connected and belonging. May all beings be free.